Welcome to the 9 to 5 Joy podcast. As you can see, we're relaxed, fresh, and ready for the new season of 9 to 5 Joy podcast after the summer. We took a little break from interviews, but we're back and ready to share some amazing interviews with really incredible guests that we have for you for the next few months.
Yes, today's episode is a very special one. It is with a colleague of mine, Dr. Judy Hu, who has dedicated both her academic and professional career to really understanding through research what are the behaviors, both in work and out of work, that impact our productivity and well-being.
This is a key episode in our quest to make workplaces more joyful. We really feel that you're going to learn a lot from it, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Our guest today is Judy Hu. She is currently a consultant at Advanced Learning Partnerships, actually a colleague of mine where I work. And she, in that role, is a consultant to schools, helping them improve environments of well-being by helping improve their organizational talent and development processes. Prior to that, she was an assistant professor of psychology at Roger Williams University, and she earned her PhD of organizational psychology from Northern Illinois University. She's done a lot of research around work and non-work phenomena and how they impact people's well-being of families, and we're so excited to hear about the research that she's done and how that has impacted her own work journey in our podcast today. That research has been published in several outlets, including Occupational Health Science, Applied Psychology and International Review, the Journal of Happiness Studies, and popular media outlets as well, Self Magazine, Refinery 29. I mean, she's famous. Like, we have a famous guest. When she's not working, or at least when she has her email on delayed delivery, you can find her cooking, baking, jogging, or dancing around Chicago, the city that she recently moved to. So, Judy, we are so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. That was such a fabulous introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Share with us your journey to the extent that you're comfortable, your personal journey and your professional journey, and what landed you where you are right now.
So I first moved to the United States. Well, I grew up in China first. Up until when I was going to college, I decided to come to the United States for my college education. Had a determination of going into education-related research, which kind of coincided with what my current role in current company that does education consulting, working with Christine. And when I came to the United States, I started my bachelor degree at Wake Forest University. I was majored in psychology as well as mathematical statistics. And I chose psychology because I felt like it could be applicable everywhere. And at the time, like many college students, I didn't know what I want to do for my career. I was just trying to take step by steps. One thing that I know for sure is I didn't want to go to graduate school and continue taking classes after the 4 years. I thought that was the end point of education for me. Up until I guess the end of my sophomore year, some of my friends and also professors kind of nudged me, were saying that you should apply this research fellowship. I think you had some great ideas that we're just bouncing off of during social occasions or talking with professors after classes. And I got the fellowship, and I was studying emotions in dance and music when I was in college. Yeah, and it's like how we can interpret emotions from dance movements. And I was inspired from my leisure activities. I was part of a hip hop dance crew on campus, and I was like, you know what? What can I do in my research that I can include my dancer friends and also my research friends and like put them all in the same room? And that was a project that I did, which eventually led me to pursue graduate degrees. And
can I ask you a question about that? What was your hypothesis? Like, did you have a hypothesis around how dance would impact emotion?
Yeah. So what's interesting is in the previous research in that area, we found that, music, we can interpret universal emotions from music, from just listening to music. It's kind of like, if you listen to a rock music, that deep, heavy metal, it tends to interpret as sort of like anger or some kind of more extreme, highly activated and negative emotions, whereas the soothing music tends to be more relaxed and it's deactivated, more like relaxing and joy type of emotions coming out of those more soothing music. So I thought if there are emotion-related research published using music as the avenue, what can we interpret from dance movements when we black out the clothing, all of the kind of the using the silhouette of the human body when we're dancing, and also removing the music that the person was dancing to. And let's see if the interpretation of the music and the dance were consistent with each other. And I did find something interesting that was consistent. It's been a while, so I don't remember exactly what I found. And, like from there, I got to present at regional conferences and share my research to others and like make more connections there that really motivated me to pursue research and go into graduate school. Did I answer your question there?
You did. Yes. Carry on with the journey.
I mean, so I have so many more questions about it. I'm gonna let you finish with.
So I guess the question became, what specific area did I wanted to go into? Because psychology, even though it felt like a small area, but within psychology, there are so many different branches. One thing that really resonated with me is hearing a lot of people talking about their professional lives and hearing what they're anticipating going into when they're about to start their career. So some of my friends in college back then were pursuing accountancy or business degrees, where they often describe that future career as very stressful and easily burnt out, long working hours. And I thought, well, what are some ways that we can really, mitigate that or help them to fix that problem? So taking industrial organizational psychology classes and learning more about some of the existing knowledge or just concepts behind that had made the move to pursue IO psychology as my graduate degree focus. So that's where I started my doctoral studies at Northern Illinois University in the program that's a joint of social and industrial organizational psychology. It's so mouthful. Every time I have to yeah. So yeah, I think that was kind of the bulk of the past couple of, I guess, 7 years since I started my PhD degree studies and starting doing research in various areas, and then finish it in 2021. Got a academic position at Roger Williams University where I got to teach psychology to undergraduate students as well as continue conducting research in my area, focusing on the occupational health psychology stuff. So I think that was my professional journey. And the final part, which is the most recent transition, where that's the reason why I met Christine, was I kind of wanted to see more of my research or what we often study as a scholars more reflected at the front, really practicing it, and how can I really get in front of the published research paper and me as a person deliver those evidence and to the people who are in need of them. So that's made me switch from academia to a practice or as a practitioner. So I got to still do research, but in the applied setting using educators as my samples and to really help educators to battle burnout, which is also a hot topic in education, and, have a better efficiencies or productivities in a workplace as well. So that was my professional journey in that show.
Can I add something just because I'm first of all, thank you so much for being here. We are very, very happy to have you. We think that you bring such a different and very knowledgeable and wise perspective to, the work that we're trying to do here. So thank you. And then you talking about your whole journey, I hadn't heard about this hip hop research thing. I'm sure you hadn't either. And I guess the question that comes to me is, in your journey, right? The other people that you work with, I will venture to guess that you were pretty unique in the sense that the trajectory that you had, what brought you there, and then these sort of the inspiration that you got from people around you from trying to solve this burnout like issue, like I don't know. And I guess my question goes to how many of the people that you were going to school with and working with on a regular basis do you feel had that sort of integration of what's happening in real life, solving these type of problems, and sort of supporting people's well-being while going into organizational psychology?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I felt like my answer to that is I felt very fortunate and so lucky to have some of the people around me. I felt like I've always, for example, meeting my mentor on doing undergrad for my research, as well as being able to find the advisor I call her my academic mama, essentially, for the rest of my career. They're all just people who are think in the same fashion. We're always trying to think about what are the implications or why are we doing this? What are some outcomes does it deliver to? And even some of my close friends who are either in the IO psychology field or in other, medical field or some other areas, I feel like we always had a vision. We always had a mission to think about, where do we come from and what are some of the ideas that we had talked about at a dining table or, in some kind of random occasions that inspired us. And I think that still is constantly sparkling ideas and that push us forward. And even, initiating various kind of collaborations. In fact, one of my closest friends living in Chicago, she was my roommate from my doctoral degree. And she has been a kind of the very passionate, driven IO practitioners since day one. And I had been more academic person, when I was in the PhD program. But the two of us had always, had these conversations and talk about work and talk about, we're just imagining the career that you wanted to have. And I think having those conversations and Mapi, you mentioned that makes me realize how valuable those conversations have been, and I never thought about, they actually made an impact in each of my little decisions.
Beautiful.
So tell us a little bit about your research. What made you choose the topics that you chose as you were going through and deciding, I'm going to pick this and this and this? What were the inspirations? Were there conversations? What things drove you to choose those topics and kind of became your why?
Yeah. I guess, earlier when I was mentioning my professional journey of why I chose organizational psychology, it kind of alluded, there was a lot of inspiration from trying to understand employees, workers' well-being, workers' wellness, and what are some ways that we can mitigate that, the interventions that we can implement to organizations or to individuals. So that we can all optimize our workday or optimize our personal lives. And that kind of opened up sort of the avenue of or the channel of various research buckets, smaller research buckets. So this whole area is kind of I guess if you just deal with psychology, IO psychology, and there's occupational health psychology, which I reside in most within my research program. And specifically, there are several areas that I study the most. One is some work-related aspects that had facilitated or hindered our employees' productivity or their well-being, specifically the use of technology. So we have these all kind of tools, computers, cell phones, and all these communication technologies that's becoming this tool that's tethering us to work anywhere, anytime, all the places. And so what are some ways that we can, how do we understand why that tethering is problematic? What kind of psychological impact did it have? So that's kind of leading to some of my research on collaborating with my advisor doing PhD program on workplace telepressure, the sense of need to check your email all the time, need to respond to your email really quickly, and that leading to the lack of recovery, lack of being able to reserve time to yourself. So that leads to the next area of research is studying how does your non-work area, non-work activities could facilitate our well-being or help us to replenish that resources that energy or that attention when we're not at work. So that kind of goes hand in hand with each other is, during work hours, what are some problems? And during our non-work hours, what are some things that we should be doing together? How did that facilitate the work engagement, the work well-being for our employees? So that's generally a summary of my research.
So it's basically, and it's very interesting that we got to talk about this, because I feel a lot of the focus that we've had so far has been around what happens during work hours, and shifting a little bit the conversation to, first of all, how do we balance, not in a sense of, like having 50% rest, 50% work, because that's never going to happen, right? But how do we really sort of separate and be present in that off work time so that we can also recover and come back to work, right? And be productive and be happy and be joyful. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about, those strategies? Because something that really called us to bring you in as a guest is this, very intentional thing that you've done about moving a little bit away from academia and then trying to get into the more actionable and sort of real life things and tools. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about, like that sort of off work time, the telepressure that you talk about, and what you have identified as potential, supports or things that, people can do to really mitigate that, or where it comes from too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the technology piece, because that's like, I guess chronologically, when you're getting off work first is like, how do I stop checking my emails, and how do I not feel like I'm constantly having this Gmail opening or having that notification? So one of the pieces of research that I did was to implement this email batching interventions for the individuals. So really instructing them to figure out a way to set aside maybe an hour during our non-work time. So for example, typically I consider my non-work hours as from 6 p.m. to whenever I, go to bed, or next morning I get up for work. But oftentimes, after 6 p.m., I still felt like there are some remaining unfinished work that I really wanted to get to. Maybe there's an email from Christine that I felt like I just wanted to get that done before that. She probably gets up earlier. She's in, one time zone before me. So maybe I should send that, even if it's after my typical work hours, but at least I felt like she can get that, when she start working next morning. But how do I do that, but without feeling like I had to do all these other work things that I need to finish that I probably won't be able to for the rest of the evening? So one thing we instruct our participants to do is to schedule about maybe an hour or sometimes 90 minutes during your non-work hour time. Well, the caveat is there are people who are like, I don't want to check anything, and then that's fine. And then they can totally say, I'm not checking anything at all. That's just my typical habits, and I'm just going to continue doing that. That's totally fine. But for me, I would say I'll check maybe from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. where I had finished dinner. Before I just been a couch potato for a little longer. During that hour, I will concentrate and actually get some of these work-related things done. So I'm more productive, but also knowing that after the 9 p.m., I have a full closure. I close my laptop, close my email, nix the notification on the email, and I can fully enjoy my leisure activity or any other things that I wanted to go engage in. So that has been showing important implications in terms of behavioral change. People are actually feeling like they're checking less, and they don't feel like they're constantly being notified from engaging in that practice. And that had resulted in lower level of telepressure. So they feel like there's less of that behavioral change had led to less of the preoccupation, less of the urge to respond really quickly, and even further down impacting our reducing our burnout for a little bit. So that's the technology piece, where just a small behavioral adjustments could result in some bigger impact. And
it seems like it almost gets to, being very sort of behavior, like controlling your own behavior. If you are the type of person, which luckily I've never been, but if you are the type of person who, is regularly thinking about work and checking in and, responding to an email that came through and just looking at their phone all the time, to give them those sort of that framework and that limit of saying like, okay, you can do this during work, like in off work hours. However, you have this sort of limited amount of time to do it. It kind of needs both needs, right? Is if I'm understanding correctly, right? The need to chat, the need to disconnect as well.
Yeah, Matthew, you bring up such a good point because, in our research, we even further looked into that distinction, you versus, we'll categorize you guys as sort of like a segmenter, preferring to segment your work and non-work, sort of have a really established strategies to manage that really properly and at least to your own preference. Mm-hmm. And there's also the integrators who are the folks that tends to merge the two together. They might be on the train to the bar and it's still like replying Gmail, but maybe that's your style. And we found that this intervention, this email batching strategy that I was mentioning works better for those folks who are considered integrators. They don't necessarily result in that behavioral change or the reduced telepressure experiences for folks like segmenters like you. So exactly that distinction is super important. And, it's like picking the ones that that really fits for you, right?
Mappy, I'm going to call you the segmenter. I'm not allowed.
I'm the segmenter. But that is a really good differentiation. And it makes me think about, those integrators. Did you find, so you found that the telepressure decreased, but did you also find a difference in how they were experiencing their actual work hours? But because I kind of, my hypothesis there, and I don't know if you looked at this, but my hypothesis will be if you have sort of this sense of achievement or, like the ability to disconnect, then when you re-engage, you are a little bit more fresh and you can, look at things maybe from a new perspective and engage in a different way while you're at work. Is that something that you looked at, and is that something that you found?
We didn't look into the next, that connections there yet, but that's something that other researchers have done. But you're right, that behavioral change, the checking less of emails, the less email engagement behavior, that is sort of reflecting the less working hours because you're reducing how much of exposure you are having during your supposedly not work time to the work content. Right, so I think that does reflect to what you were saying, that when you're engaging that better strategy of managing your inbox as an integrator, it does result in that behavioral shift and less working hours, or less hours to expose to the work content, and which leads them to experience lower telepressure. But what you brought up a really good point is that, once because it's a kind of a continuum, right? Once you down the strategies and managing, you gain back those hours that's supposedly for you. So that kind of brings us to the next research stream on the leisure activities or off work activities, which we want to engage in more of these active leisures that can help us to replenish and fulfill our psychological needs. That's really important for our psychological well-being. And recently, actually, a paper that's published maybe just a couple of days ago that I came across, they found that if you have a lot of recovery activities at night, sort of that individual episodes of feeling relaxed and feeling like you have control over your leisure time, feel like you're psychologically detached from work, that actually leads to better same recovery experiences the next afternoon. So it's kind of like what you were saying, how does today's experience carry through the next day? And then they do. It's a very dynamic process. That's the reason why we also focus a lot of our research on the leisure activity, holistically our workers, and how do we make sure all aspects of our lives are being taken care of.
I love that. The idea of people really understanding that the more that you can relax, disconnect, be doing things that you actually enjoy, and concentrate on those, the more productive you're going to be and the better time you're going to have when it comes to work. And if companies took that seriously to the point of, I believe that there are maybe companies that have policies of like truly like no work after, in certain periods of time, or companies that have like the mandatory week of vacation for everybody. I've heard that some of those are coming up now. And, I like you will say, oh, they're doing it because they're nice. I actually think it's a really smart business decision, right? So being able to show what with the research is amazing.
And I think it actually, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say what you mentioned is kind of like the step one, right? The organization having some kind of higher level of policies or practices. But what's more important, I know you're going to get into this, but what's more important is that application is a leader who's sitting maybe 3 floors up of me said that we should not check our emails after work. And yet your direct boss, your direct manager is still constantly emailing you after work. It's not going to work. It's kind of like, backfiring. It's like, okay, well, there's kind of inconsistency there. So that's why there's even more work that's being done by many amazing researchers that are trying to further encourage that clarity on the norms or setting clear expectations within a work group. Even that onboarding conversations of what is your expectation of me responding emails, or what is your typical expectations of finishing up a project, or how do you communicate that deadline typically to your subordinates? I think these are some conversations that we felt like they're so easy to know, but sometimes we forget to include those in our daily conversations. Like you assume that we need to get things done really quickly. You assume that we all respond to email really fast. So yeah, that was just something that reminded me when you're mentioning about that.
Absolutely. It's about those sort of very the norms that are like out there and are very clear to everybody, and then the cultural norms that we may not see but that people sense that they have to respond to.
Yeah.
You were gonna ask something?
I was just gonna say that I think some of this cultural some of the stuff around work culture brings us back to a conversation that we've had. I mean, you were recently out of the country, and we were talking about just, there's very noticeable differences between countries and geographical locations in how work is treated and how that interacts. And I imagine, Judy, that that's something that you, if not researched yourself, have seen in the research.
Yeah. Hold your breath. We are collecting data across the country.
Yes.
So I have a collaboration that's being ongoing. We're trying to collect data from different countries. Actually, Mafia might probe you on the
I'll be happy to
country data collection, but we're trying to figure out, more consistently to study what's the response time looks like when we're pulling countries from different cultural dimension. Like some, like the Eastern culture that tends to be more group focused. Like group goal is more important than my individual goal. So I want to prioritize what does the organization need, so that might motivate them to be more responsive and probably be more connected electronically to work. Whereas, the Western country individually, that might be less, feel like the need to constantly responding to the group needs. But that's our hypothesis. So we're still trying to, figure out if the data speaks to that hypothesis there. But yes, that's such an important point. At least, being Chinese, having some Chinese friends, I know that even the electronic tools where the softwares are different, there are these software that gets you much easier. I feel like we're still more email based, at least like our organization is still primarily emails and our project management tools. There's less of these instant messaging platforms. But if that becomes more prevalent, I believe that, you can easily get notified really quickly, and, it's a totally different norm setting and sort of work culture.
So we understand that you also, part of the research that you've done has been looking at, how things, or how the epidemic, COVID, the pandemic, like really influenced the way that these things are perceived or have been sort of taken in and looked at. So tell us a little bit about that. Like, what do you feel, how do you think COVID had an impact on the research that you do, or the area of knowledge in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say when COVID first hit, we all have that, it's like, oh, we're all trapped inside. But the professional me, the academic research me was like, yes, I have something.
I get to go.
And yeah, my one of my mentor from Northern Illinois, Dr. Mahesh Subramani, and I, we collected a three-wave data from telecommuters. So people who are working remotely, you know, they were the folks that got kind of thrust into working from home because of COVID, and which is probably majority of us. And from that research, what we found in our work is that for those folks who were residing in, you know, a COVID area that's not as high incidence rate. So like, we're thinking about maybe like, I always use like maybe Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota, where it's more massive. And so the COVID rates are lower. Those folks had a much easier adaptation to bounce back up. Like they're more easier to recalibrate to their work-family balance and resulting in a quickly calibrating back to the general level of their well-being. Whereas folks like in maybe New York City, you know, if they are in a high incidence rate, it's constantly going, the COVID threat is really high, they had a relatively slower bounce back rate, slower adaptation to the new norm. Which is really interesting is that although we're all coming back to finding our new balance, it's almost like originally we had our work balance right here, and then we got kind of bumped down a little, but then we were able to refine where do I feel like it's the good point, the optimal point for me now that I'm working from home. So everybody were able to be resilient and then go back to finding the new normal. But it just, the geographic region had some impact on how soon can you find that the balancing point for yourself. Yeah, so that was something really
Talking about the balancing point, can you define that a little bit better?
Yes.
Or a little bit, like when you talk about balancing point, what specifically are you referring to? Like what every person sort of defines as having good balance? Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of a subjective evaluation of to what extent do you feel like you were able to balance in your work and family needs. Some of the question that we ask them is, to what degree do you agree that you're satisfied with how you're balancing your work demands or what you need to do for work and what you need to do for your family. So that was a typical question that we asked to assess, you know, your perceived satisfaction with your work-family balance. So for some people, you know, going into working remotely immediately, it's kind of like figuring out how do I manage the boundaries between the living room where the kids are playing and the bedroom where that turned into a workroom. You know, so I think that's the disruption that we all had to navigate. But then what's interesting is we all had a pretty good style or pretty good pace of reorganizing, reconfigure our lives so that we can regain and that balance back and that we feel comfortable at.
So as part of the research that you did with related to COVID and the way in which people sort of were able to bounce back to that balance, I wonder if we have seen how COVID made a lot of people question how much they wanted to work, what type of jobs they wanted to have, and they've made a lot of changes in their lives after COVID. So I wonder also whether their own definition of balance didn't change, like before versus after, right? And how that impacted what you were looking at.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting question. And we do have a lot of evidence suggesting, you know, if you're living in that high incidence rate area, it does pose more threats, perceived threats among individuals on the concerns of how am I going to live my life under these limited circumstances. And that, you know, obviously results into poor well-being, impaired well-being that we had to refine ways to fix ourselves, essentially. And I would say that's a really interesting research question that probably, at least I myself have not explored or have seen research exploring, is how does this shape the way how we look at cognitively the meanings of our work. How does it shape our work purposes or even personal purposes? That will definitely provide a lot more interesting insights into how we, as a workforce, may shift in in the future as we continue navigating various kind of, I don't want to say threats, but various kind of these stressors or external events that will always have an impact on us, whether it being sort of exposure to news from other countries or being understanding what might be a local changes of rules or policies that might have an impact on my own personal lives. I think all of those things are interesting to look at. But what I will say is that, earlier when we were talking about these non-work activities or leisure activities and the importance of work recovery experiences and how does that, leads to better engagement and sustainability at work. I think all these research evidence still applies even during COVID or in the post-COVID world. We always need to make sure that we are feeling psychologically detached when we should be, and having that relaxed experiences or, even engaging in cognitively stimulating leisure activities that could make us feel, accomplished or feel like we have that competence and feel that we have that autonomy of our own personal times. And all of those are still important regardless what kind of situations we're in. So having the, reassuring those research evidence continues to manifest in our research or in organizational research has been really compelling for us to continue making these recommendations in terms of how we can manage psychological well-being for all of our workers.
So you've done a ton of research. You've worked with different groups of people, different groups of professionals, and looking at how particular behaviors can impact well-being. Talk to us a little bit about your own professional journey. We know that the biggest thing, right, is the behavior change and how it works. So talk to us a little bit about your own journey of well-being and work, and what parts of your research, if any, you've applied to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just such an interesting question, because oftentimes I don't get that a lot. I feel like we assume that if you make that recommendation, you're practicing.
You're right. Yeah.
I don't know how. I think that might be an interesting survey question to do. But when I was still a doctoral student, being in graduate school, whether what kind of area you were in, it's like there's just so many competing demands that you're trying to meet at once. It's like, managing your coursework, managing your own research, finishing up my doctoral program on time by writing up the thesis or the dissertation that I have to finish. What else? I was a teaching assistant at one point, so I had to teach my own course at Northern Illinois, and my personal times, how do I need time for my own hobbies, for my other things that I want to do. So when that happens, even though at the time I was writing papers about how you should establish these boundaries, how you should use these strategies to manage technological demands or managing work demands, or how you should really engage in more active leisure, but not just, watching TV when you're on your own time. All of those recommendations were in my writing. And yet at the time, I was not practicing any of them. I was responding emails at 11 p.m. I was, my roommate at the time had to drag me out of my bedroom to relax, and I was watching a lot of TV, but not so much of other active leisure. So it's kind of like trying to find a workout buddy, and so that I can get somewhere else to engage in some activity that's not just sitting and sedentary, And so that was kind of earlier during my doctoral degree. And I think in the past year or two, now that I felt like I was relocated to Providence, Rhode Island for my assistant professor job. And I guess being the new place kind of stimulated me to figure out a way that works better. It's like, how do I communicate to my colleagues? How do I communicate with my students? How do I set that expectation clearer so that I'm not getting this bad reputation that you can find Dr. Hu any time of the day. She will respond to you at 11 p.m. So, starting using Christine, you mentioned that the delayed email delivery has been useful. It's like, even if I get a panicking email at 11 p.m., if it's not urgent content, I can reply it, but I don't want it to show that I'm actually replying any given time of the day. So I will deliver my email to next morning 8 a.m. Or set clear in my syllabi that, expecting a typical response rate of 24 to 48 hours, so that my students understand what's the general expectation for email responses. And also, using some of these auto responses when I'm out of office or when I was on vacation during the summer to my work colleagues. One interesting that I did was I went to what was that? Acadia in up in New England area for like a week of vacation. And what I did during that time is, instead of just a typical out of office auto reply, like, oh, I'll be out of office during this time, I'll get back to you as soon as I can, I also added a picture of Acadia, the picture I took when I was going on the hikes in there, and saying, hey, this is where I am. So yeah. I actually, when I got back, I actually got some of the email telling me that's actually such a smart way to use auto reply. And then I was going to use it myself. And I was so excited because it makes you feel like you're a real human, that you have the life outside of work. And, and then they were also able to appreciate the vacation that you're having, the good time that you're having. And I think, and then, it further sparks conversations when I come back to work, that we can, unpack my vacation a little bit and then have a nice discussion about, various hiking trails and things like that. So I think that was something I felt really rewarding and fulfilling to apply what I study into my own practices. And I think that's slowly getting better. I'm still working my way through it, but definitely applying more than before.
I love that. And I'm going to use it now. And I'm sure whoever's listening is like, oh yeah, that's one. That's one of you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask something about, because you mentioned the passive and active leisure activities, and I believe we talked a little bit about it before, but I don't think it has come up as defining them here today. So if you could tell our audience a little bit about what I believe you've also done research on, like using like sort of the difference between those two and how they have a different impact on how you recover. And then, so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because I think that's such an important differentiation too. It's not just not replying to the email, but what are you actually doing and what are you engaging on while you are off work?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was also something that I did and published and actually a Journal of Happiness study where I instructed participants to engaging at least 30 minutes of an active leisure. So here, the way how we distinguish it is passive leisure tends to be more the low effort activities, and particularly we're referring to watching TV alone by yourself, sort of just like on various kind of like streaming channels, one episode after one that you can't really like get out of it, sort of like a loop. And the active leisure has a huge category. It can be physically active. This includes the typical workouts that you do, yoga or going for a run, or in competitive sports, if you do them. Cognitively active, these can be reading, learning a whole new language. And I was doing Duolingo earlier this year, and then that will consider a cognitively active leisure activity. There were also socially active leisure. So if you're engaging some like movie watching and really having an intense conversation about a movie with some friends that were family partners, that would be considered sort of a socially active leisure. And sometimes, some of these activities that we typically think about, they may be leisure for you, but may not be leisure for others. So I love cooking or baking, especially cooking. And so for some people, cooking, making dinner every day, it's like a demand. It's like, I have to make dinner again. I don't know what to make, right? But for me, that's like a sort of a creative process. Like I want to make things that make me feel really fulfilling and make me feel accomplished if I had cook a meal that my family enjoys, right? So all of these things sort of, there's that subjective piece to it, but also we kind of encourage folks to engage in these more higher level of intensity and more active leisure. And what we found in the research is that when you're engaging active leisure, even even if you also watch TV that day, it's like not saying that you shouldn't be watching TV. It's kind of like adding on to that, what other active things you could do. We found those folks experiencing higher level of fulfillment with their competence needs, the need to be able to sort of accomplish things and feel like, oh, I finished that, felt great, felt like I've mastered something today. And also that psychological detachment piece where we felt like we were able to fully not psychologically thinking about work when we're in our non-work time. And all of that, we're able to translate it into our better emotions and just how we think about how satisfied we are with our leisure, with our life in general. So that was something we found in the leisure-related activities, which definitely provided a lot of practical implications in terms of the benefits of some of these leisure activities versus the common ones that we see.
Yeah.
So helpful.
Yeah.
Our audience is going to absolutely love that.
They are.
Yeah.
Yes. So just briefly here, because we're coming up on our time, but I want to address this. Like, are there certain things for organizations as a culture? Because, I can do a lot of changes myself. I can make individual changes. I can listen to the 9 to 5 Direct podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I can read Dr. Hu's amazing research and come away with all the application tips. But if I'm working in an organization that's not supporting a culture of well-being, there's going to be some disconnect, right? So what are things that organizations that can really do to set up this culture where it makes it not just easier, but almost intuitive for employees to be adopting these types of behaviors?
Absolutely. And I think that's something we are trying to push the research into, is to really consider all stakeholders involved in this process, and really getting that buy-in from the leaders, from our C-suites folks, to understand the importance of well-being. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is that leaders' well-being also matters, right? If leaders are not feeling that they're recovering from their work, and we know our leaders are really busy, they're exerting efforts into facilitating the business benefits and values day after days. I'm sure they probably have less hours than us to, for our own downtime. So recognizing that leaders are also needing the time to recover, and also understand there are these strategies leaders can adopt for their own work recovery. The modeling of the recovery themselves could also be very beneficial for the subordinates. You as a manager, having the conversation about how did you rest last night, or what are some recovery activities you do over the weekends, could be beneficial because they're communicating that this is a typical things that people do. We're not talking about, oh, how many hours did you work over the weekend, or how did you finish this project last night, right? So I think these casual conversations could really resonate with subordinates in terms of amplifying that importance of well-being for the organization, or for all of the employees at the organization. I think that's one of those ways of informally setting the tone correctly for the values, or to what extent does an organization value employees' wellness. And in addition to that, earlier I was mentioning the importance of setting clear expectations for availability, or for meetings norms, or for email responding norms. Be clear to say that if I'm going to send this email to you, it doesn't hurt to add one more line at the bottom saying that, hey, I know this just to be clear that this is not needing you responsive or need your attention within the next couple of hours. Feel free to get back to me by the end of the week. I think that provides some reassurance that, okay, that's just one more task on my list, and there's no urgency, or there is an urgency, but there's a clear urgency of when I need to get this done, right? So I think that's something that leaders could do to clearly establish the responding or technological related principles in the workplace.
Yes.
Yeah. So good.
So usually we give people one piece of advice, right? As we wrap up the episode, and we've heard so many really applicable, tips that you have given us, and that I believe our audience are really gonna dig into, because these are just so inspiring and then doable, but then also they are backed up by the research, right? That you've actually seen that these work. So, so we're gonna, instead of asking you for the one piece of advice, we're gonna ask you for two things. So the first one is, what is one piece of advice that you will give individuals who are looking to establish personal practices that will improve their well-being at work?
I would say practice the control of your boundary. That has sort of, I'll give you two elements into the one piece. One is really draw the boundaries around technological use for work purposes, so that we can having more control over to what extent do I really want it to be tethered to work? How do I make sure that I allocate my time and my resources correctly to your own expectations, to various roles that we hold, various hats that we wear? How many hours or to what degree do I want to wear the work hat? To what degree do I want to wear my family hat? And also it's important to really protect my personal times, kind of going to hand in hand with the technological pieces, really reserving time for ourselves, making sure that we are using wisely with our personal times and using them valuably, that we feel like we are able to create the quality memories for ourselves, for our families, and I think that's also really important for all of our psychological well-being.
And then the second piece of advice that we wanted to ask you for is, what piece of advice will you give organizations that are looking to create environments of well-being? We have seen, I don't know if you're familiar, but we talked a lot about the Deloitte report on employee well-being. And one of the things that came up is that organizations and leadership, for the most part, want to engage in this type of work. They want to invest in well-being. They are eager to do so because they're losing people. But they really struggle to come up with the how. So what is one piece of advice that you will give those organizations that want to improve employee well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one is setting clear expectations on just generally work, and then communicating that expectations to your subordinates or employees, and also modeling your behaviors and really understanding what is the general needs of our employees and what are some strategies that we could adopt that will be beneficial to them. So it's a two-way street, having that two-way communication, implementing something, gathering feedback on what works, what not, especially at a lower level. Having just your direct manager, having that conversation with your subordinates could be more beneficial than just setting the vision in the strategic plan, but we're not sure to what extent does it get down to the individual level. So I think these are some just things that it's easier to say than done, but I feel like as long as we make these baby steps, they could definitely boost to the leap.
I love that, baby steps. Yeah,
One day at a time.
one day at a time.
It can be daunting when you think about it in the big picture, but if you're just consistent on, this is where I want to go, this is what I want to achieve, and then, take one baby step at a time, you'll continue to move in that direction.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. We appreciate you so much and the work that you do.
Yeah.
I feel that the world needs many, many more people like you who are thinking about these things, like really trying to apply them. One of my, I would say, personal criticisms to academia is that, there are brilliant people doing this research and getting to amazing conclusions and information and things that would be so helpful for people to have. And then they fail at communicating them, and at figuring out ways for people to actually apply those principles. So the fact that you're doing that is just very encouraging and heartwarming, and it brings us a lot of joy, I think. So
Yeah, you bring a lot of joy. You do.
Thank you. And I think it's important to have you guys, this such a important, and I think it's gonna, it's already probably getting so many attentions because it's such important topics, and you're able to kind of package into joy as a concept, but all of these important tips that we're delivering to focuses. Without you guys, we won't be able to, communicate well, from the research that we do to the reaching to more people with these evidence or suggestions. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We love this episode. We hope that you did too. And we want you to know the joy is not over. Next week, we are going to do a very special episode. Moppy and I are going to reflect on all of the information and goodness that Dr. Hu brought to us. And we're going to talk about how is this relevant to our workplaces, to our context. So we hope that you'll join us next week for that episode.
In the meantime, we want to remind you to subscribe to our content. We're actually starting to post this in YouTube as well. So we're going to be in YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Also, follow us on social media. We're everywhere as 925Joy podcast. And we are very happy to hear from you. Let us know what you think, leave a review. And if you have ideas on guests that we can invite to the show, we would love to hear from you. In the meantime, spread the joy.